Good morning, everyone. My name is Barbara Volotskova. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And I'll be serving as a moderator for today's Counterpoint Southeast Asia webinar. For those of you joining us for the first time, Counterpoint Southeast Asia is a webinar and policy brief series that addresses questions of strategic significance to the Southeast Asian region by putting together diverse perspectives from invited experts from the region. Each issue of Counterpoint tackles a crucial topic, and today specifically we are addressing the question of the ASEAN-EU partnership and its role in sustaining multilateralism. So let me just quickly introduce the topic. ASEAN and the EU have been dialogue partners since 1977 and strategic partners since December 2022, regularly reaffirming that they are crucial allies in reinforcing rules-based multilateralism, which they believe has been key in promotion of peace and stability post-World War II. However, as you know, multilateralism has undergone profound changes, and scholars and analysts have come up with concepts such as diminished multilateralism, competitive multilateralism, contested multilateralism, and highlighted that multilateralism faces several crises, such as, for example, crisis of relevance, arguing that international organizations are struggling to resolve both long-standing problems and also emerging threats. On top of that, the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas war, and the US-China strategic rivalry further suggest that multilateralism may be eroding. In this context, effective and sustainable multilateralism and free and fair trade have remained foundations of the ASEAN-EU relationship, and the EU is ASEAN's third largest trading partner and source of the FDI, and is consistently the preferred and trusted third party in hedging against the uncertainties of US-China rivalry, and also in doing the right thing when it comes to also the global community, according to the State of Southeast Asia survey that is conducted annually by ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Having said that, while Southeast Asia's level of trust towards the EU remains consistently high, the 2024 trust rating has dropped by 9.5 percentage points, and the distrust levels increased by 5.8 percentage points, which means that it is at its lowest level since the EU launched its Indo-Pacific strategy in 2021. Given this background, we are here today to discuss a key fundamental question. Does the ASEAN-EU partnership play a pivotal role in sustaining multilateralism? In other words, what are the main challenges and opportunities for ASEAN and the EU to forge a closer collaboration and reimagine what their partnership could look like in areas of common interest while upholding the multilateral global order? And to help us address this question today, we have three speakers, three experts from across the region. Before I introduce them, I'd like to remind each of them that they have 7 to 8 minutes to present their key arguments. And after each speaker is done with their presentation, we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to submit your questions or comments in the Q&A box you see it below. And don't worry about waiting for all the presentations to finish. If you feel that you have an important question, you can type it in the Q&A box, and I'll read and ask it after a portion of the webinar. So with these points in mind, I'll proceed to briefly introduce the speakers in order in which they'll present. And these are just brief introductions for their full impressive profiles. You can refer to their biographies at the CHE website. To begin with, we have Dr. Yo Le Hui. Le Hui is a senior fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, vice chair of the ASEAN Chamber of Commerce EU, and a roving lecturer. She's a senior adjunct fellow at the RSIS and teaches a course on EU and contemporary European security. Then we have Mr. Matteo Piacentini. Matteo is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science, University of Philippines, Diliman, where he's also pursuing his doctoral studies in political science and international relations. And he's a former official at the Italian Ministry of Defense, currently residing in Manila. And last but not least, we have Mr. Anielo Iannone. So Anielo is an expert in Indonesian studies, currently pursuing a PhD in international relations in Airlangga University in Surabaya. And Anielo also serves as a lecturer in the Department of Government and Political Studies at Diponegoro University in Semarang. So we have a great lineup today. And let's start with Lehui, who in her essay for this counterpoint Southeast Asia proposes an innovative way of how ASEAN and the EU can work together to translate their strategic partnership to a mutually beneficial outcome of ensuring proper functioning of the rules-based order. So I give the floor to you, Lehui.
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning to everyone, and good afternoon or good evening to whoever may be tuning in from areas outside of Asia. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this panel on the EU-ASEAN partnership and on this issue of multilateralism. Since I'm the first speaker, let me indulge in perhaps discussing a little bit by what does multilateralism mean. I think the problem for us is, of course, we use the same word, but maybe we ascribe different meanings to it, right? So if we start from the theoretical understanding, or at least what was Professor John Ruggie, who wrote a book, the famous book on multilateralism matters in the early 1990s. His book, Multilateralism Matters, was written, of course, in the immediate post-Cold War era. And he referred to multilateralism that at its core, multilateralism is an institutional form which coordinates relations or cooperation among 3 or more states on the basis of generalized principles of conduct. And that is these principles which specify appropriate conduct for a class of actions without any regards to the particularistic interests of the parties or the strategic exigencies of the circumstances. And that successful cases of multilateralism in practice require acceptance among members of the concept of diffuse reciprocity, not specific reciprocity, but diffuse reciprocity. And this is a very important concept. That is to say that this arrangement is expected by its members to yield a rough equivalence of benefits in the aggregate and over time in the long run, right? So it's not like this transactional quid pro quo kind of reciprocity. If I give you A, you give me B. But in terms of, the benefits are accrue over the time, and that in the end, in the long run, everyone gets some sort of mutual benefits out of it. The European Union's understanding of multilateralism is probably fairly close to that of Ruggie's conceptualization, right? That means for the EU, they like to say that we abide by a rule-based order and all that, right? That's abiding by agreed norms, rules, and principles on appropriate conduct for a class of actions and embracing this rule-based order. Right? The EU, in fact, always like to say that they conceive itself, its identity, right, is based on this acceptance of multilateralism as a way of life. Right? They always say multilateralism is in the DNA of the European Union. To the EU, multilateralism to them is a way of tempering power politics and an answer to the problems that require collective action. So I think the EU's idea of multilateralism is perhaps quite close to the theoretical conceptualization by Professor Ruggie. For ASEAN, however, I think multilateralism is usually a euphemism for the broad embrace of the ASEAN way of what we call inclusive, big tent engagement of all interested actors especially through ASEAN-led mechanisms such as ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summits, the ADMM+, right? So it's a way of saying that when ASEAN talk about multilateralism, and subscribe to norms of sovereign equality, they always talk about inclusive engagement of all interested parties in dialogue and negotiation. Yeah. So they often equate multilateralism with multilateral diplomacy, focus on the dialogue and negotiation based on the norms of sovereign equality, principles of non-interference in domestic affairs, and non-use of violence, for instance, to resolve conflicts. So this is perhaps slightly different. The focus is more on the diplomacy and not so much on the so-called rule-based order, but really the fact on engagement and dialogue, and usually trying to be as inclusive and as open as possible. So if ASEAN and the EU want their strategic partnership to play an important role in sustaining multilateralism beyond what I call rhetorical commitments or statements, I think we need to first come into an agreement on what multilateralism we are talking about, right? We also need to understand the inherent difficulties and limitations of multilateralism. In the 2020 article, I think, recent by Professor Hans Mau, for many of you who study the EU and its foreign policy, you could have probably read quite a bit on Hans Mau's work on EU. His article called Multilateralism, Variance, Potential, Constraints, and Conditions for Success. He said that in order to make multilateralism as effective as possible, a realistic assessment of its preconditions and a wise understanding of the peculiarities of multilateral politics are essential. I will not go into details of his article. You can read it after this seminar or webinar if you are interested. So, but I want to take from his point, I think the potential for ASEAN and the EU to reimagine and renew multilateralism there is a potential, right? The reason I say that is because ASEAN countries particularly understand power politics. And we are in an era where, while EU think that multilateralism is a way to temper power politics, we are actually in an era where power politics is inherent. We have great power competition and it's becoming more intense, right? So the environment has changed from the immediate post-Cold War era to one that is of intense geopolitical rivalry. So power politics is right at the center and facing all of us. And we have to take that realities into account, right? Because great power competition is back in full force. So relearning the history of how to manage and sustain multilateralism in this kind of environment is important. So in an environment of increasing competition among great powers, multilateralism's future lies in understanding that multilateralism is not universalism, right? It's not about universalism, and that multilateralism is not just about talking about cooperation and collaboration. In fact, multilateral architectures in this environment can be, of course, used to support collaboration on shared challenges, but can also be created to provide, for instance, off-ramps in crisis management, and for some, to manage competition, right? So if you think of multilateral structures started by China, like AIIB or Belt and Road, these are AIIB, for instance, you can consider a multilateral institution, but it's started up in competition, perhaps you can say with World Bank or ADB. So there will be this kind of competitive element, and we have to rethink all this very carefully if we want to really make multilateralism work. So in the policy brief that I have submitted in conjunction with this webinar, I also try to advance perhaps a new way of thinking of marrying the idea between multipolarity and multilateralism. In this current geopolitical environment, of course, we're also talking a lot about multipolarity, right? We are moving from unipolarity with the dominance of the Americans or the West, if you may say, use that term, to a much more diffuse and much more multipolar world. There are different poles emerging. So I thought, but when we think of multipolarity and we think of usually when we think of multipolarity, we go back to the analogy or go back to the history of Europe in the 18th, 19th century, where there are different poles, right? And each pole is sort of an empire on its own with this different sphere of influence. And when these poles collide, of course, it leads to conflict, but sometimes you could also have certain stability if the poles amongst them come to some sort of accepted rules of conduct, or that's what we call the concert of power, right? They decided that there should be certain they manage the relations in a way with certain acceptance and everyone not encroaching into their own, the sphere of influence, and there's certain agreed way of moving forward to provide certain stability. But instead of conceptualizing poles in purely based on this concept of power and sphere of influence, I thought what we could do is perhaps, because we are not in the 18th, 19th century, right? We are in a world which is, despite all the geopolitical competition we see, which is in reality, we are much more interconnected and interdependent. Because of the hyper-globalization of the past decades, we have become much more interdependent and interconnected, right? So we perhaps need to conceive the poles in the, and we have also what we witness, what we call diffusion of power. We should no longer think of the world in terms of just state-centric actors, right? There are many actors. If you want to talk about regulating and talking about how to deal with the technological disruptions brought about by AI and all that, we need to involve the big tech companies. They are key actors in this area, right? In this pole, if you want to call the technological pole in our global order, right? Or in our international relations system. So we should think of a broader way of trying to conceptualize and bringing the different actors and not just focus on state actors when we talk of a pole, right? And in order that within this so-called pole of influence, whether it's in the area of climate action, in the area of technology and all that, we should have certain rules and principles and norms, or certain broad rules and principles to govern how the parties in these areas should conduct itself. So I use the term multilateral polarity, right? Multilateral in the sense of using, again, going back to when we talk about multilateralism, we tend to think about rules, norms, principles, and also negotiations and dialogue. So multilateral polarity. We need to understand that within these poles, there are actors of consequence, right? That means those actors that matters. Not all matters. So in climate action, you would say the EU is a very important player. So it's a pole. But within this pole, there are other businesses, the big businesses that are very much, if you don't bring them into this pole and have certain to be the ones also contributing to the discussion about the rules and norms and on how these issues should be managed, and what collaboration we can do, what are the kind of rules to govern the competition in this area, and at the same time think of, is there any certain niche areas where collaboration is possible? Then we are in some way failing, because the power is much more diffuse. We have more actors that matters. It's not just the state, but also these big businesses, big tech companies that need to be involved. So that was my sort of contribution to trying to rethink, this idea of multipolarity and multilateralism, and how to think how to marry this, because why I use this multilateral, because we need to also understand the concept of power. We cannot deny that power competition and big power competition exists, and we cannot pretend that there's not going to be power politics in this geopolitical environment. So we need to recognize that and bring that into focus, that there are power elements that are important, but at the same time we need to think it beyond just state actors, but also think of whatever, how to take into the realities, recognize some of the constraints, of course, of what big powers want, and to be able to understand the interests and take this into account when trying to design principles or norms to govern collaboration or competition in a certain area. So I'll just stop here and then hopefully have more discussion later.
Thank you, Lehui. You raised three very interesting points. So first, about maybe different conceptual nuances when it comes to multilateralism. So you mentioned that it's in the EU's DNA, and then maybe from ASEAN sides, it's focused more on diplomacy. And then also we must situate these two conceptions in, as you mentioned, the power politics that is now an important constant. And then I find that what you suggested, as we could move forward, this idea about multilateral rules-based polarity is really interesting, because it could actually maybe help overcome what we usually struggle with, the singularity trap, right? That we should not allow one single issue to derail the broader strategic need for engagement on other issues. So, and also you mentioned that it's important to co-design rules involving non-state actors. And this could also help address probably the practical gaps that might be not so obvious from a state actor perspective, right? So thank you so much for your view, and we'll definitely discuss it during the Q&A time. And then now, complementing the perspective you offered, we have Matteo, who zooms into one of those poles where the EU and ASEAN have enhanced their cooperation, and which is maritime security. So in his article that is linked to this webinar, and it will be published after the webinar, Matteo explores both the progress and challenges in this issue area. And so Matteo, if you please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Dr. Hui, for the very insightful remarks, which actually brings directly to my essay for today. As I realized that my conceptualization of multilateralism is pretty much a European one, in the sense that my remarks and my comments on maritime security were focused on upholding the so-called rules-based international order as one of the main preoccupations of the European Union is indeed upholding such order in the maritime domain and upholding the rules of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as and this is another point raised by Dr. Hui, so I'm glad it's already discussed. Power politics is shaping international affairs, and probably power politics and the US-China competition, as well as other threats stemming from superpowers trying to carve out an area of influence, are actually threatening the way seafares is conducted. Especially, I mentioned in my essay the tensions and the maritime disputes and sovereign disputes as well in the South China Sea. The EU sees that as a threat also to its interests, in the sense that conflicts and clashes in this area of the world have repercussions in trade, especially. And so the European Union, through this normative framework of upholding the rules of UNCLOS and the rules-based international order, has also a policy dimension, which is we need to at least strengthen cooperation in that area in order for these sea lines of communication not to be disrupted. In this sense, there is a normative convergence between ASEAN and the EU, because both organizations have, at a policy level first, an interest in ensuring stability in the region of Southeast Asia, which is, of course, a region whose affairs are managed by ASEAN, And at the same time, ASEAN welcomes, includes in its regional affairs other extra-regional actors, and being both regional organizations who have in their DNA norm building, there is of course a lot of ground of convergence for ASEAN and the EU, and this also translates in how the EU has engaged ASEAN and ASEAN has engaged in the EU in the security domain in maritime affairs. So on a pre-normative level, they both acknowledge the necessity of upholding this ways to conduct seafarer, which is according to UNCLOS. On the other hand, in several instances, the UN and ASEAN, for example, through the ASEAN Regional Forum, they have discussed on how to materially enhance this cooperation and enlarging this cooperation, information sharing, coordination, capacity building, tackle non-traditional security threats in the region. Because yes, in a sense, both organizations look at least not that powerful in facing directly the threat posed by superpower competition, but at the same time, they perceive themselves as mutually necessary to provide other goods, which is, for example, sharing practices against smuggling, trafficking, which are actually threats to the sea line of communication and to the rules-based international order as well. But usually this is not what's something that is focused, that is the focus when we talk about interstate diplomacy. So 2 points I want to raise here is that they're both coordinated on a normative level very strongly, and then also on a practical level, they do what they can in trying to try to enhance their role as security provider in non-traditional security. So they also want to promote this kind of goods. Nonetheless, both have tried to adopt, and both have adopted maritime strategies or let's say policy papers focused on maritime affairs. ASEAN has its own recently adopted maritime outlook, and the EU in the sphere of the common coordinated common foreign policy, the PESCO, together with the designing of its own Indo-Pacific strategy, the EU has also adopted a maritime security strategy that, of course, is encompassing different regions of the world. But this is my take. A lot of this maritime security efforts are progressively being focused on this region by the EU. The difference between the two, however, is that, and this is my another point I would try to raise, is that on a policy implementation level, the EU seems to have a different approach, as the EU has a domestic interest to protect, which is the one we discussed about the sea lines of communication. So in a sense, seeing the steps that EU has taken in providing actual material support, or at least establishing multi-level dialogues on what do you need here in this region? What are the fields in which I can actually provide assistance in order to uphold this rules-based international order together and pursue this common interest of maritime security? On the other hand, the ASEAN maritime outlook is actually a bit more aspirational, and maybe we know that ASEAN, in terms of actually taking steps, has several constraints generated by the way ASEAN operates. And so ASEAN wants this to be another framework through which states can cooperate to overcome disputes. So in a sense, ASEAN has a different concept of stability, which entails mutual dialogue and overcoming issues together, not necessarily limited to regional actors, but also extra-regional actors. And this is consistent with the concept of centrality. On the other hand, the European Union, in my opinion, wants to take it a step further. And while it sees cooperation with ASEAN as essential, especially on norm building and non-traditional security, it also feels that to implement fully its strategy, it needs to go bilateral. So we have, for example, some initiatives that the EU has undertaken to strengthen maritime capabilities with key partners like Vietnam and the Philippines. For example, with the Philippines, it has established a subcommittee on maritime cooperation recently after Ursula von der Leyen visited Manila in 2003, and that sort of like kickstarted this new framework for cooperation. And we also have the EU commencing a series of roundtables on maritime security with Vietnam. So in other words, and to conclude, on a normative level, I think that the EU and ASEAN have a certain common ground, and they both have a common interest in norm-building maritime security rules together in order to uphold a rules-based international order in the sea. And this is consistent also with several declarations and policy papers by both organizations. On the other hand, acknowledging that ASEAN, especially in resolving maritime conflict, suffers from a bit of paralysis of action, the EU at this juncture is taking some further steps in actually transforming this norm building into policy. Then lastly, to conclude, to let's say provide a tentative answer to the question, is this cooperation between ASEAN and EU essential or pivotal to upholding multilateralism? I would say yes, because the European Union has no interest, and at the same time is not even perceived to undermine ASEAN's centrality. And what the steps taken by the EU as an organization, then when it comes to single nation states, a bit different, but as an organization has always been non-confrontational, and in my opinion, extremely careful in respecting what are the norms that characterize ASEAN regionalism, and they operate within the framework, try to operate within the framework of ASEAN regionalism, also in engaging bilaterally these actors. So that would be it, and I will be eager to hear your comments and questions on the topic. Thank you.
Thanks for those arguments, Matteo. So you mentioned that the EU's and ASEAN's approach to maritime cooperation converge on the normative level while facing an implementation gap that is filled by bilateral cooperation. And then you had some really interesting suggestions related to the question that we can, of course, discuss further after the last presentation. So moving on to our final speaker, Agnello will round up the presentation sessions. In his paper, Agnello has focused on the ASEAN-EU cooperation on democracy and human rights, which is possibly the most contentious issue, but which at the same time reveals perhaps the area of quite a huge raw potential. So Agnello, please, you can take the floor.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a very pleasure and honor to speak with you today. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Dr. Myung and Matteo, for your speech. Okay, so actually, I will continue with the last point about democracy and human rights, as Barbara have said. And actually, it's a topic quite complicated because almost in academia, in comparatives between EU and Asia, they tend to criticize this kind of comparatives. But I think it's important to see how the two organizations think about democracies and how they grow in terms of human rights. Yeah, I think an argument is my paper that was not an important agenda, not too much in terms of ASEAN-EU relationship. However, I think, especially after yesterday, the European Parliament poll, it's very important to speak about democracy, also democracy level in terms of both ASEAN and EU. But it's important to understand the difference between both. In terms of structure and ideology, UE and ASEAN can be considered the opposition of each other in terms of how they come, in terms of how they born. One, then UE is based on integration, and in terms of identity is very strong. The others, ASEAN, can be considered the opposition. We actually born in terms of during the Cold War as a block between the Soviet and the US as a new organism in the international order. Then and grow until now with the idea of ASEAN way, and maybe we can discuss after if we can still speak about ASEAN way that actually promote regional identity among the region. Yeah, another point in particular we to focus, and I try to criticize, is how actually European Union and ASEAN have different idea of human rights. Doesn't mean that the European Union do better in terms of human rights, but have different idea of human rights in terms of universal integration process as a major pillar of European Union, and cannot be considered the same of ASEAN. ASEAN tend to have a different concept of human rights, and then maybe compare maybe is considered not as a level as a sovereignty or no interference in the region. Okay, so it's maybe one of much topic than can make difference between European Union and ASEAN. So this different interpretation and also implication of human rights and influence and can be influence the political relationship between European Union and ASEAN, especially when we talk about the principle of no interference in national sovereignty can be a really strong step between both. If we move more inside in terms of human rights challenge in UA and ASEAN, we can see that both have some kind of problem in terms of human rights, but in ASEAN is now in the spotlight because the Myanmar crisis. ASEAN was high criticized in terms of no have a good connection in terms of what you were doing in terms of Myanmar. It was not actually a very good let's say intervention, just busted over 5-point consensus, but was not made clear the decision how ASEAN should be resolved the migrant crisis. Maybe was not at top of the issue for the ASEAN itself. In terms of the region, is also there is quite kind of complicated because I see there is the rise of authoritarianism and autocratism among the region, both in European Union and also in Asia. For example, the victory of Prabowo in Indonesia confirmed this kind of tendency in the way of authoritarianism, but also the rise of dynasty politics in Philippines, authoritarianism achievement in Myanmar, in Thailand, there no clear situation in the politics, and can be make the leader might prioritize economic performance instant for the over the really basic multi-risk governance among the both organizations. Yeah, also this we need to put this a really complicated situation among global issue. We see as protagonists both European Union and ASEAN. When we talk about, for example, the China come over in germination of ASEAN, but also the conflict with China and US in how they look in the Pacific can also influence the internal and external politics in both directions, both in European and ASEAN. It can both, of course, complicate the cooperation of democracy and human rights issue in the region. Yeah, in terms of UA, yeah, I stand out that after the yesterday election in European Parliament, we see there is a quite strong return of populist right in politics, and we're gonna see how we evolve, especially in countries like France and others, how this can affect the democracy level in Peru and how they will after that big effect of with the ASEAN cooperation modalities. But in this pessimistic perspective, we can see actually maybe we can see in some challenge opportunity. Yeah, I was maybe too much a pessimist in terms of there is some rise of authoritarianism and human rights, but there is a very strong aspect you can make more positivity the cooperation in terms of human rights democracy between European Union and ASEAN, especially when we talk about the civil forum and civil society activists. They can have a really huge rule in for let's say for making cooperation between cooperation between both the region much stronger. But yeah, there is also some kind of, for example, how actually civil society forum can be like an antidote for this kind of undemocratization process in terms of not just human rights, but human rights very huge complex sphere, but in terms of inactivists, especially for example, we talk about, for example, environment rights, indigenous rights, and also regarding and to freedom of speech and rights. It's also European Union ASEAN can work together for new opportunities, especially if they have a huge civil forum achieve study forum to speak. So in the conclusion, actually, I don't want to be too much pessimist, but yeah, it's quite complicated when you speak about human rights and democracy in level of UAS. Both see there is a kind of tendency to turn around in terms of authoritarianism or populist right. But yeah, in the future need to be more cooperate for the sense of, I mean, try to work together, especially in the level of civil society level, to make some kind of let's say multilateralist cooperation in much stronger way. This is actually what I try to argue in there still. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnello, for sharing your viewpoints. And I think it's interesting because you actually rounded up very well, also going back to Lehui's point at the start, because we have this idea of maybe we could use more the multi-stakeholder engagement, right? So like we mentioned, big tech companies, and maybe when it comes to democracy and human rights, as you mentioned, that would be civil organizations. And I think it's ASEAN and EU are already looking this way, because there is this joint task force when it comes to the deforestation-free products, right? And I think the civil organizations, some environmentalists from Indonesia, Malaysia asked to join this joint task force. So this could be something that it could be definitely explored further. But I will not. I'll stop here with my comments, and we already actually have some questions lined up, and I will read them one by one as they arrived, and then all of you can answer, or whoever feels wants to answer, you can just chime in. So I'll start with the first question, which is from Dr. Dennis Hu from CAG. Strategically, does EU-ASEAN relations really matter? EU leaders are not terribly engaged with ASEAN member states. So I think this is an interesting question, because I think it makes sense to ask this question because probably a lot of people in Southeast Asia notice that, the EU is a big economic power and normative power, but when it comes to strategic power, especially military security, then it might not be felt that way, especially that was also highlighted in the State of Southeast Asia survey. So what do you think about these questions, and what could be done about it? So maybe we start, anybody wants to chime in, or shall we just go around?
Well, I'll just start. I think indeed, if you have been following the State of Southeast Asian survey done by ISIS Yusof Ishak, you'll find that they say that when asked who are the most important strategic and political player, of course, US, China, and the EU is only usually about 3 to 4%, right? It states the EU as a strategic partner. So in that sense, I think, so this is a survey, it's about perceptions. I think what is important is the reality. I think from the EU perspective, they have come to realize, especially in the past couple of years, because of the need to de-risk, right? To have supply chain resilience, supply chain diversification, and all that. They found that this region is increasingly important for their own strategic interests. right? So because of that, I think the understanding, especially from the EU side, that is this region is increasingly a strategic region for the EU to engage because of its own interests. And then, of course, they have also in all their fact sheets and all the things that they put on their website recognize that because trade that passed through this region is very substantive, right? I can't remember how many percent of trade from Asia to Europe passed through the Straits of Malacca. And so from that perspective, the Southeast Asian region is becoming very important for the EU. But of course, the engagement with ASEAN has to be seen in that they have to try to understand that ASEAN again is not as institutionalized as, for instance, the EU, right? Because of the institutional differences, the way they engage the ASEAN as a bloc, they would also need to engage bilaterally with the various ASEAN different ASEAN member states in order to reinforce the strategic dimension of their relationship. So I'm giving a very long sort of, but there is the understanding, there is an important region, and that there is need for much more engagement. So I think whether the other way around, whether ASEAN see the EU as a strategic partner, again, a long answer to that question is that because of the geopolitical competition and because ASEAN keeps saying that we do not want to be forced to choose between China and the US, and that we want to. So the very fact that ASEAN applies both trying to balance and hedge against this environment means that they want to engage as many different partners of consequence as possible, right? Whether it's Japan, and you see that answer given in the strategic in the survey again about the EU being one of the potential partner that, in fact, high in the list, right? The EU is one of those third party or potential partner to engage if ASEAN wants to hedge against the fallout from the competition between China and the US. So based on that two facts, I would say that I think EU-ASEAN strategic partnership does matter, but of course the realities is also the challenges internally in our own region sometimes distract us from paying more attention to a far away, geographically distant partner, right? Because of course we know for the EU, is the war in Ukraine is much more an immediate threat to their security, to their existence. So they need to put a lot of attention and resources on that. And in the case of ASEAN, we also have our own internal problems, as just mentioned, on Myanmar, and on our own cohesion, and to maintain our own cohesion in the face of this increasing strategic rivalry.
Thank you, Lehvi. Yes, Matteo, please, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, I fully agree with Dr. Hui. I just wanted to add that it also depends on which kind of on the expectations that are from ASEAN towards the EU, in the sense that what they expect is the EU to act as other extra-regional players that have more leeway also in providing certain goods, like I think it was mentioned in the question, security. Well, it depends on what we think security is. And so we should also, however, stress the fact that, yes, the EU coordinates foreign policy among members, but members have also their own agendas, and these agendas diverge. What I'm trying to say here is that what I see the EU doing is setting the stage, setting frameworks, and trying to support where it can. But when it comes to foreign policy, and especially like assistance in certain areas of security, I'm talking about defense, for example, that's pretty much up to member states. And there are some member states that have clearer, or they have Indo-Pacific strategies, like, for example, Germany or France, but both of them have different Indo-Pacific strategies, also based on their actual interests in the region. France has territories very near to this region, Germany doesn't. And there are other states that leave to the EU most of the job, others that still have to decide where to deepen cooperation in certain fields, or deepen their engagement in the field of security in the Pacific or not. Like, for example, Italy. There's an ongoing debate on whether we should emulate other European countries in actually getting to deepen cooperation in certain fields. So just to wrap up, I'm not surprised that the perception of Southeast Asians, as mentioned, related to the state of Southeast Asia, is very tenuous and very limited on the role of the EU. But in my opinion, it is also because, given the pressures and the threats that the region faces, there is a preference from both individuals to focus on what is actually needed immediately. But at the same time, I think at a more government level, this deepening cooperation with the EU and ASEAN is something that both ways, both actors as well as member states, do not want to give up. Probably we will see some results in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. Agnolo, is there anything you would like to add?
Actually, I'm leaning with Matteo about this part of.
Okay.
So absolutely.
Thank you. So let's move to the next question. So the next question is about the EU-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and whether it's feasible in the near future. So what are the stumbling blocks to achieve this FTA? And I think this question is related to what we often hear about a sort of an ambition disconnect, right, between these two sides. So do you see what do you think are the main bottlenecks to be overcome, and can this regional FTA, according to you, be accomplished maybe in the long term? Lehwi?
Yes, I think this has been talked about for so long now. When the EU first started in 2007 with this ambition to have an EU-ASEAN FTA, and then unfortunately, after a few rounds of negotiations, discovered that the level of ambition is different. The institutional differences between the two are so great that, and the different levels of development within ASEAN is so huge that it's just impossible to have and of course, over human rights conditions in Myanmar and all that. All these add up to make them realize that it's not realistic to have an EU-ASEAN FTA. And I think those conditions remain, right? We still, so what the EU has done is that it has gone ahead for its bilateral with the different ASEAN member states, and have of course concluded EU, Singapore, EU, Vietnam, and now restart and hoping to conclude the EU and Indonesia comprehensive economic partnership agreement soon. We started with Thailand and all that. I think, again, the official position is that this is a distant ambition, an objective that we still hope to achieve. But I think the reality on the ground is that they will go all the bilateral and try to conclude as many bilaterals as possible. And once that can be achieved, then perhaps we can look at how there can be an overarching framework to sort of tie all these different bilateral FTAs together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Lehwi. So do I understand well that you think that maybe these bilateral FTAs could serve as building blocks to later a regional FTA?
Yeah, I think that would be how this is conceived, just like what we have for the regional comprehensive economic partnership, RCEP and all that, is to go with the various different possible bilateral routes and then come up with some sort of overarching framework to tie it up. But again, we must also take into account that the mood against this kind of FTAs so-called big FTAs, right, has changed. Right? We are now seeing rising protectionism. Again, if you think 3 years down the road, how the international environment or economy will change, we don't know. So as I said, they will say this is a distant objective. This is an objective that we hope to, but it's not the immediate priority for the EU, or for that matter ASEAN, right? So the bilateral route is the way that the EU has sort of resigned itself to, or are quite happy to pursue. And then if the time comes that we could have up to 7 or bilateral FTAs concluded, then how do we put on a sort of a cap over it, and say that now we also have a regional block-to-block agreement?
Thank you. Thank you for your view. So Matteo, what would you say?
Yeah, I would just like to add that I agree with what discussed. It's going to be a long process, and I don't think in the short or mid-term there will be significant progress, in the sense that even if an agreement, a draft agreement, is actually signed between the two organizations, then the ratification is upon member states. And as we see from the recent European elections, in some key states, let's say a form of populism is winning, and that kind of political parties have a divergent economic agenda. And so the risk is that we may see something similar to the attempts carried out by the US with the Obama administration with the CPTC, well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that then was blocked by the Congress because of electoral purposes, protectionism. That is something that is within now the debate in the European Union. So on a very, aside from the aspirations or the planning of the Commission, then when it comes to ratification, maybe this free trade agreement will be blocked. So what I see is that we need to have a very strong convergence among all European states to make this happen, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And to my understanding, I have limited knowledge on the status of negotiations, but they're still like negotiating, so there's no common agreed upon draft. And what I'm trying to say is that even after the draft is signed, then the ratification process may never materialize, at least in this span of time. But I think this is also this is very telling on the status of free trade agreements in this juncture of decoupling, the risking, and not exactly in which like great economic blocks are not that keen deepening trade and cooperation. So yeah, I'm fully on this.
Okay, thank you. Anila, what do you think the main challenges are for achieving a regional FTA?
I think also in line with I think it's can be, especially as now in the European situation, can be in my opinion be more faster, especially with the new leadership. Maybe can be, because I think it's more about an economic and the perspective of European, even if Farah is to grow the economic perspective, and this kind of spare and this kind of new situation in both of the region can be maybe facilitate, but in the cost of other one. So probably we can go over this kind of aspect. Probably the cost will be some kind of aspect in terms of no specific regarding to human rights level in terms of the agreement and so on. I mean, in my understanding of the FTA. Yeah, mute.
Thank you. We have some more questions lined up, and the next one is for Lê Huy. So it reads, how are we to understand a rules-based order when the role of power makes it possible for external forces to interfere and act against the interests of ASEAN without censure? So I'm not sure I understand exactly, but seems a bit linked to maybe the conceptions you were mentioning at the start. So how would you, what would you highlight when it comes to the answer?
Perhaps I answer in the indirect way, just as I mentioned about when we talk about multilateralism, it may mean different things to different actors. Similarly, when we talk about rules-based order, of course, we have been hearing, particularly in the more and more about whose rules are we talking about, and and whether the rules that are applicable, let's say in the 20th century, are still fit for purpose, right? So when we talk about the rules-based order, is it the Westphalian order or the liberal order that the West tried to sort of entrench during the time of the post-Cold War era? Or was it the most immediate after the Second World War? We still have this UN Charter, which in some way encapsulate more a Westphalian order, right? So again, we have to be very clear when we talk about rules-based order, what do we mean by it? And and again, I want us to move away from this. Of course, there are certain fundamental principles that the UN Charter enshrine, which many countries have sort of accepted, right? Like territorial integrity, sovereign equality. But UN Charter also talk about the principle of non-interference. If you think of that, then we go to the as what I said, when we try to conceive a post of function in different areas where you have different rules governing different areas, right? So you have WTO, a set of rules in the WTO. You have a set of rules governing freedom of navigation in the Straits. So I think we need to, again, think more broadly in this way, rather than, that as though there is a universal set of rules. Again, as I try to explain in my, multilateralism is also not about universalism, right? So we need to, so I don't know whether I answered the question, just like you mentioned, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but talking about the rule-based order, again, we need to interrogate that point and deconstruct what do you mean by a rule-based order.
Yes, thank you. I think this it might become actually critical in the future, because we already see so much forum shopping, right? And then with that, the risk is that the countries might just pick the forum that has the rules that suits their interest. So at one point, actually, we will, and then there, I think that if I have to express my opinion, where actually ASEAN and EU could, be proactive and bridge this Western and global South perspective and say, look, these are the rules that always must be kept in mind, because we cannot just overstep here. And maybe from ASEAN side, it would be, making sure that there is ASEAN centrality and so on. And then, yeah, so it's difficult, but probably an essential question. And it's definitely not easy to, you mentioned important points, but I think we'll have to come back to it in the future, and definitely different regions discuss it together.
Yeah, but like you said earlier, I think the idea about co-designing the rules, because there are many emerging issues where we need to so-called co-design the rules, and that is important. The idea that we need this dialogue, we need to sort of be willing to re-examine some of our own entrenched views or perspectives, right? And re-examine our own blind spots and all that, in order to really talk, when you want to talk about an inclusive, open dialogue, I think we all need to go back and re-examine our own biases, our own perspectives, and be humble enough to say that let's look at it from a fresh perspective and see how we can really co-design some of these rules that are fit for purpose for the 21st century.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Matteo, yes, feel free to add.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add that in terms of joining efforts to co-design rules, I want to put the emphasis on the fact that, however, they need to remain rules, because what we observe now, especially in this region, is that informality is taking over, over like rules that set clear duties and obligations upon members. Because, for example, a lot of what discussed regarding the management of the South China Sea disputes has something to do with informality and non-binding declarations and so on and so on. But I think there can be a ground to claim that they're not really effective in managing these disputes and this situation. And on the other hand, we saw and observed the proliferation of minilaterals in the region, which has been observed by some commentators, do actually entail a degree of informality. And through informality, well, the more powerful actors can actually dictate terms and ways of action. That is something that, however, multilateralism, on the other hand, constrains. So where I really agree that a revisiting of Westphalian rules or a deep discussion on the foundations of or the Western foundations of international law specifically is essential in at this moment. I also want to emphasize that this cooperation must have the objective to upholding rules and not just designing conducts that are informal, because I think empirically they tried, and the situation is a deterioration of security and international affairs. So yeah, I just wanted to add this point because this is something that has been observed by some commentators. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for raising this point. And then since we are all discussing this point now, I'll just maybe add one sub-questions into this, and maybe I'll ask Anil for his opinion. So if we are talking about co-designing the rules, what do you think, what platforms are actually best placed to do that? Do you think it could be, you know, ASEAN-led mechanisms, or it could be done under the umbrella of international organizations, or maybe when we are if we are talking about multi-stakeholder engagement, do you think that, for example, 1.5 track diplomacy, such as Shangri-La dialogue, would be best place? Or what do you see in your view as, you know, as platforms that would allow us to do that?
Okay,
And
if I got if I got the question, you asked me what I think about the eventually new mechanism in terms of ASEAN.
So what do you think are the platforms where, you know, the kind of like revitalized rules could be discussed? If you want on democracy, you can mention in that area.
Yeah, revitalized rules in my perspective, but in my perspective about ASEAN, and maybe it can be an unpopular opinion, could be there is no place for rules in terms of ASEAN, because ASEAN is, I mean, in my perspective, ASEAN is not based in terms of rules. So we need to create for the part of rules to speak about the rules, because when we speak about ASEAN, ASEAN is a night organization speak of, you know, keep the place in peace. But when we talk about rules, they all think about their own rule in domestic level. It's very clear when you put it in terms of, for example, human rights. They already their own perspective of human rights in terms of as a member. So I will answer your question, and maybe it's quite important among the others to create first a platform to speak about room in terms of ASEAN. Not with the eventually copy literally the European Union, but one organization maybe at the up of ASEAN is itself that can, you know, harmonize the level of norm in ASEAN, because in my opinion there is not this kind of organism yet in ASEAN.
Okay. Yes, that's actually an important point about the harmonization of rules. Okay, so I'm just minding the time, so I'll just move to the next question, and that one is, I think, for Matteo. How would EU respond if China crosses over the Philippines red line in the South China Sea?
Right. Well, that's $1 million question, because so first of all, according to the recent presidential declarations, red lines entail, unfortunately, the death of Filipino sailors during one of these incidents that are occurring in the South China Sea. According to the latest declarations that may trigger the mutual defense treaty between the Philippines and the United States, So, but at the same time, these are actually options that should be tested against actually what occurs in the South China Sea. When we talk about red lines, I think the best way to answer the question is like, let's design at least two scenarios. The first scenario is that yes, there is a very severe accident that entails unfortunately the passing of some personnel, but there is hesitance whether and how to respond and to intervene, because like there is like a very big hiatus between the event and the response, and in that frame of time anything can happen. I think Graham Ellison with this Cuban Missile Crisis teaches us that policy then comes into play at multi-level and in a multi-level manner. So for sure the European Union will condemn what's happening, expressing concern. But in that specific situation, I don't think that the European Union will take a response against China. This is the question. Probably it will reiterate and maybe deepen assistance to the country that actually suffers this accident. In the hope, however, because like I stand by what I wrote in the comment, that in the hope that the dispute or the specific crisis is resolved through dialogue with China and not exactly through military response, because this is not what the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategies are about, and it's in no interest of the European Union to respond as such. Also because regardless, I may add, regardless on the discourse and the rhetoric on the coupling and the risking, especially the risking, the economic engagement between the European Union and China is essential for for the European economy. So there are also these kind of considerations to play that the Commission, like all the officials, have to then respond on what they do. So in this scenario, which is probably the best case scenario, there will be no substantial response, because it's not said that a conflict may arise automatically. It depends on the entity of the response. And so the European Union at that point will stay, I think, a step back. And in connected to this, I think the underlying question is sanctions, question mark. That is a very remote case. And I think the European Union will resolve to that only if the worst case scenario happens, which I don't want even to fathom here, because I don't think it will bring up to that point. Also because compared to the sanctions that were imposed to Russia, these sanctions will be way more detrimental for the European economy. And we can actually read all the steps taken by the European Union in deepening cooperation and dialogue, because we should be clear on that. Not only to littoral states, not only with ASEAN, but the European Union wants to keep and maintain a certain level of cooperation with China as well. And non-antagonism is the backbone, and cooperation is the backbone of European foreign policy. So that would be the response based on these two scenarios. However, with a caveat that the European Union will watch very carefully the intensity or the consequences of what we can consider a conflict and a response, and adjust its response accordingly in order to protect both multilateral order, let's remember this, both multilateralism and cooperation, as well as its own economic interests.
Mm. Okay, thank you, Matteo, for highlighting these considerations. So I'll now merge. There are two questions that are a bit similar. So it's basically about synergies of the ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific, AOIP, and then the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. So the question is, the AOIP offer an approach for ASEAN member states not to choose a side between US and China, Can EU's own strategy on the Indo-Pacific offer a similar approach? Is this a potential area of collaboration between EU and ASEAN? So yeah, anybody would like to answer, please feel free and you can take the floor.
So when the Indo-Pacific, the EU Indo-Pacific strategy was released in September 2021, I think the seen from the ASEAN side, it was it's an attempt to also have a much more inclusive, open, development focus and focus on issues of governance, right? So the priority areas are human security, on ocean governance and all this. So of course, the ASEAN welcomed the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy when it was first released. Of course, a lot of attention then was focused because AUKUS was announced at the same time when the EU released its Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think a lot of people never read about it, and instead a lot of attention was focused on AUKUS. But again, this is just to highlight the point that I think it was an attempt by the EU to present a strategy that is in some way aligned with the ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific, to be much more inclusive and focus on development. And also on economy. Of course, there's the dimension of security, ocean governance. But increasingly, I think, especially after the war in Ukraine started, when the war in Ukraine, there are concerns that the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy may become more and more aligned to the kind of Indo-Pacific strategy of the Americans. Yeah. So to allay that kind of concern, what the EU has done is to then hype up the global gateway as part of as something that you should see when you look at the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, you should also look it together with the global gateway initiative that the EU has also used as a way to engage the region, right? Offering an alternative development, infrastructural development possibilities for this region. So the Global Gateway program that the EU has, of course, mentioned about putting in place $10 billion for the Southeast Asian region, and then applying this Team Europe approach, which means it's not just the EU, but also considering the efforts by the member states that are invested into the region, helping into all these development projects, whether it's green transition with the green financing, green transition, building of wind, solar farms, and all these mobility projects. So I think in that sense, if you look at it, there is synergy, and I think it's appreciated in the region. But of course, you can say, again, people like to compare and say, if you compare to the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, 10 billion that is put forth by the Europeans are not really that significant. And of course, also in the last year, you see that the Global Gateway, because if you look at the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, the geographical outreach is slightly different from that of the Japanese or the Americans, right? It stretches from the east coast of Africa to this region. So similarly, in the Global Gateway, in conjunction with the whole Indo-Pacific strategy, you see the EU also focusing attention on the African continent, and in part because of this idea that I brought up, that they are now, because of so-called understanding the risk of over-dependence on a certain country. So there's all this de-risking and supply chain diversification. So there's a lot of efforts put into, for instance, they have this, what they call the critical raw minerals alliances that they are forming, that they are trying to build with African countries. Right, so you see those things happening, and for me, in a way, it is also the EU being thinking more strategically as it engages the different regions and circling it back to its own interests and its overall strategy of trying to become much more strategically autonomous and more resilient in the process.
Thank you, Lehwi. So now there is one question from Achim Alan de Merlo for Aniello. So Aniello seems to express a pessimistic politicized judgment. How can we link pessimistic election results with the reduction of human rights and democratic principles? So Aniello, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was pessimistic in the sense that I say too much. In my paper, I think there is too much difference, and in this period, in this era where this the rise of authoritarianism both in the region can be a pessimistic way to see the politics in both the region. Indeed, there is a problem in human rights, and it's I think quite clear also in European Union now, and also in Asia. From my personal perspective, I see Indonesia personally, and I see there is some kind of effect after the election in terms of authoritarianism in the region. It was also before with Jacobi, and in European Union, I think also in Italy in some way, but also with the one of the right populists in the European election can be, some threat for human rights and democracy process also in European. I mean, can literally split the European Union in some different parts with more extremist and more populist and more democratic. It be very dangerous for the integration of European Union. I guess in European, in ASEAN, I think it's quite clear that there is a problem with authoritarianism in almost the region. Personally, I speak for Indonesia. There is, especially when we talk about the Kenyan law, how the law is used for repress the freedom of expression. Now in Indonesia, it's just passed the new regulation, and yeah, for this I was pessimistic in this way about the democratic situation in both the region. Of course, it's my opinion to be pessimistic. But
thank you, Aniello, for the clarification. And now I'll again combine two questions. So there is one question reading, increased EU interest in the region is not surprising. Nevertheless, we must recognize contrasting sensibilities, such as political, social, etc., between the two regions. Do you see this limiting the extent of cooperation and engagement? And I think to this we could also add, of course, different levels of economic development, right? And then there is a question below which reads, this could be like a concrete example. How will CBAM, which is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, impact EU-ASEAN relations, which is actually basically probably related to those different levels of development. So anybody would like to chime in on this question?
okay.
Lehwi or Matteo?
I think Aniello wanted to add
Oh,
something.
Aniello? Okay,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Can I try to just to I will not cover the SPM, but I will just cover the truth about interest in the region and election. I guess yes, it's not surprising at all. The master context between do you think I don't see there is limitation instead of cooperation engagement above the region. I mean, it depends what we meet about cooperation engagement. Of course, it depends how we analyze. But in terms of cooperation, in terms of democracy, especially in economic perspective, I don't see any kind of limitation. Of course, when we speak about, for example, there was a little bit when the use of the palm oil issue. European was not talk about actually in terms of use palm oil, but in terms of about labor abuse at the time. So it was the kind of standard, but nobody said we need to stop or limit our cooperation among the direction. I don't think both ASEAN and European don't have the kind of intention. And about the last resort election of European Parliament, with the implication of a UA-OAS relationship, I think it depends. Maybe some leader, it always depends how the economy we work. I mean, in this case, especially with this kind of new leaders, more in the term of right populist, can be actually facilitate the relation between European and ASEAN, because also in ASEAN, in some aspects, they have the similar politics in terms of speak. I mean, they can be maybe different in terms of speak, but in terms of substance, they have the same interest. So actually, what I'm arguing in my paper, they say they will prefer support the economy prosperity also in cost of human rights and democratization. So how I see, so don't feel really too much significant complicate after the European election. I think it's my so.
Yes, Matteo, please.
Just to add, maybe this has something to do with what we said about what we consider cooperation, whether with the two regional organizations or between the EU and member states in ASEAN, because there's an institutional, let's say, mismatch, because when it comes to economic cooperation, the European Union has an harmonized commercial policy because it's a custom union, right? While on the other hand, ASEAN was not even born for that. So the way the European Union conducts cooperation in the economic sector, which is probably something that the question is trying to hint at, is that we will expect, I will expect to have the European Union engaging bilaterally or multilaterally, depending on what the European Union can do with both ASEAN and ASEAN states. We discussed earlier that the supreme multilateral form of cooperation would be maybe a free trade agreement, but there are policy constraints. And it was already mentioned that this, however, does not prevent the European Union as an entity to engage on bilateral terms some key actors. And I think this is beneficial for the region of ASEAN, so Southeast Asia, exactly due to asymmetries in development stage between members. So probably at this juncture, a tailored cooperation in trade and investments between the European Union and some ASEAN states based on their stage of development may be beneficial for the region. And I think this is also something that does not undermine ASEAN centrality, and I think is unspeakable at the ASEAN level, because of the normative convergence that in a way, with many differences and difficulties, there is. I claim that there is between the two regions. So that would
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo. So now that we are in our last few minutes of our webinar, I would like to invite the panelists to give us their final thoughts. And I know that Levi has some later engagement, so I'll first give space to you. Do you have any closing comments for our audience?
Thank you. I think the last question, which Matteo answered very well about how the different sensibilities will impact the sort of engagement between the EU and ASEAN. I think we have gone through that phase. We have, after all, 40 over years of partnership. And I think indeed our institutional differences, sometimes the inability, our own biases and all that have in many ways sort of impeded our relationship from really flourishing and reach that optimal level that we want, right? And I think they will continue, the institutional differences will continue to act as some sort of impediment. But what I see at least is what has changed compared to the first few decades of our engagement is that there's now that deeper mutual understanding that there are such differences, and we need to be cognizant of what is possible and what is not possible, and in what ways should we engage at the block-to-block level, and what ways we should do it in the bilateral or coalition of the willing, if we might say. So the flexibility of approach that the EU has actually shown over the last few years in engaging the ASEAN countries, I think would help perhaps to move the needle in terms of future cooperation. Of course, again, we have to see our cooperation also in the broader context of what is happening in our geopolitical environment. And I think that overarching desire to have our own strategic autonomy And for ASEAN's case, of course, it likes to talk about ASEAN centrality. And so the need to engage multiple partners and all that will keep that potential that for cooperation and to find ways to build our partnership and build it stronger, to strengthen the relationship. I think that will continue. And this is for me that what I hope to end on a more optimistic note, that we will continue to find ways to engage each other flexibly and with the strategic vision in mind that we need to exercise our own agency more and to be sure that we are in some way involved in shaping what is to come, shaping the future rather than being shaped by others.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lai Hui. So, yeah, I'll just quickly ask so we are not, we don't take too much extra time. Anil, do you have any parting remarks you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, but my part, yes, actually, I in some part agree with Dr. Yung. Then, yeah, a bit more cooperation between the moderation, maybe try to increase the level of civil society also among the region for make the cooperation much work in some way, especially when we talk about democratization, human rights, don't just focus on the economic prospect. This is just for me.
Okay, thank you. Matteo?
Yeah, just quickly taking off what was already mentioned. I think this demonstrates that, yes, power politics has returned. Probably we're facing some kind of bipolar, multipolar world ahead. But the steps taken by ASEAN and the EU, years and years, decades of cooperation, and especially in a way the acceleration of this the strive to find solutions, ways, and routes, make me think that, well, number one, we should never forget that these organizations are made by states, and so there is this component of the willing of these states to find solutions that go in a sense beyond, or they're not just about leaning one superpower or the other. So we're not billiard balls. Southeast Asian states are not billiard balls of China and the United States. The European Union states, as well as the organization, are not billiard balls in a sense. And what I see, especially over the last few years, is that there is a lot of learning that these organizations promote, and then it's also transferred to states on how to, well, not repeat some errors of the past and upholding certain principles and norms that matter to these states that are not superpowers, right? And I see that slowly, and with all the difficulties that we talked about and we acknowledge, we're setting the stage for maybe a path together that's maybe unprecedented. So I also want to end on a positive note on this. And just let me to conclude. It's as a European, it was really a pleasure and honor to speak at this forum, because I think we need more and more dialogue also at this epistemic community level on these issues. I've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We all know, I think we all agree we have learned a lot from all of you, and with that I would like to thank the panel for their time. So thank you very much. It is very much appreciated that you join us for this session. And of course, I would also like to thank the audience for coming over and being practically engaged with their questions. And with that in mind, I'm now closing the 11th iteration of Counterpole Southeast Asia. Please keep an eye out for our future iterations of this webinar and Policy Brief series. And I wish everyone enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the CAG of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for organizing this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.